Okay. Let's bring that music down. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Markowsky. Welcome to my studio. Today we are going to recreate another painting by another one of my very, very favorite artists. This artist is, I think, one of the most unique artists in art history. She is, or was, she passed away in 2004. Such an unusual approach, and the way that she thinks about the work that she made takes a little bit of exercise to wrap your head around. We're going to be talking about the artist. Let me get this queued up. We're going to be talking about Agnes Martin today. So, and this is the painting that we are going to be making today. And this is the painting we're going to be making tomorrow. Now, this painting was made in 1947. And this painting was made in 1974. And a lot happened in that 30 years there between these two different paintings. So we're actually going to work our way back in time. We're going to start at this point in the 70s. And this is primarily the work that Agnes Martin is most known for. This is a fairly typical Agnes Martin painting that she was making in the 1970s through till about 1993, when she sort of retired from painting before her death 10 years later. And so part of the question today, what we're really just going to focus on is making a painting in the style of Agnes Martin, as most people know Agnes Martin. And then tomorrow we're going to kind of go back in time and look at her trajectory of how really she got to the painting that we're about to make today, because I think it is really interesting for me. The way that I came to appreciate and understand abstract painting is looking at the biographies and the careers of abstract painters and understanding how they got to that point. Because personally, when I was younger and when I saw paintings like this, I thought, I'm not really sure I'm a big fan of that. That looks pretty silly. Like, I don't know, it looks like wallpaper. And to be honest, it wasn't until I was a student at Cooper Union, which is an art school in New York City, and when I studied there was a retrospective of Jackson Pollock's artwork and Mark Rothko's artwork, both of whom were artists that I did not like. I was not interested in them at all. But when I saw their retrospectives, the Pollock at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, and the Rothko, I think, was at the Whitney Museum. These are like late 1990s, to give you an idea. It's a little while ago. But when I saw the way that the artwork was organized sequentially from beginning to end, all of the light bulbs hit, and I'm like, oh, I get it. Now I love it, right? So I think what we're going to do, because today is one of our bonus episodes. I usually don't teach on Wednesdays. We're going to paint a painting that is probably most familiar to fans of Agnes Martin, and then again tomorrow we're going to go back in time, and then we'll talk about how we bridge that gap together. Okay, so actually right before I move on, I'll let you know that there is a Dropbox folder that contains all of the images you've just seen on the screen, and then an outline for those images. An outline which you can print off and transfer onto a canvas. I'm going to show you how to do that again. And here's one also for tomorrow's episode. So I'll show you where these are. You'll see in the video description below there's a Dropbox link, and in that Dropbox link you're going to see all these folders in here. And there's folders for lots of different paintings, the Mona Lisa, what's another, Batman, Star Wars, Asian History Month here. Agnes Pelton, who... I don't know if Agnes Pelton knew Agnes Martin. I just realized they both had the same first name. But they both lived in New Mexico, probably roughly, well, Agnes Pelton is sort of the generation before that. But it is interesting, the relationship between, you know, Georgia O'Keeffe, another artist closely identified with New Mexico, Agnes Pelton, and Agnes Martin today, all gravitated towards the southwestern United States, settled there, really lived the majority of their lives in that area, and were deeply inspired by the landscape and the big skies. But obviously all three of them chose very different ways to represent their experience of that space. Anyway, I'm just quickly looking through here. If anyone's interested in today's particular painting, I think the closest thing I could think of would be really the first one we did for this particular series, the Al Loving, the cube. It's a little bit, it would be different for sure, but it would fall along the lines of that this particular approach to abstract painting. I'll also let you know that there's a Facebook group just for people who are watching right now. It's where we have a great community of artists, people who are painting along with me right now. You know who you are. But obviously there's usually about 60 to 80% of the people watching each and every episode are brand new to the show. So if you're watching me for the first time, what I would love for you to do is make today's painting, upload it to the Facebook group, and then every month I do a special episode where we look back at the art that you've done. I give you feedback on it, show you how you could improve it, as well as a good healthy dose of congratulations, right? Anyone making art, I think, is a champion, especially in today's world. Very cool. Look at all these cool paintings by people. Obviously, people are also making artwork of their own that is outside of our class, and I love that. And people sharing a little bit about their own lives as well. Okay, let's move on. I just want to talk briefly about Agnes's biography. Born in 1912 in Malkin, Saskatchewan, in the middle of Canada. If you pretty much dropped a point in the very center of Canada, that's where Agnes Martin was born, right in the prairies, the big open skies, just like New Mexico, but a little bit colder in the winters, right? And that is going to play into her work as we go forward here. So, born in Saskatchewan, she moves to Vancouver, British Columbia, where I am right now, around the age of 5 or 6 with her family, and then at age 19 moves down to Bellingham, Washington, which is really just on the other side of the border between Canada and the United States. While she's down there, she becomes an American citizen. She studies at various different universities, graduating with a Bachelor of Fine Arts and a Master's of Arts from Columbia University. And while she's studying, she becomes really interested in Zen Buddhism and this particular, Eastern philosophy, and I think less so as I think she becomes interested in some of the principles and how she could apply some of those principles to her art and her approach to making art. And we're going to see another name that her art really reminds me of is Yayoi Kusama, because both of them use this very deliberate, slow approach as a way of combating some of the mental health issues that they were facing throughout their lives. So, as I just mentioned here, she had schizophrenia, and as was sort of par for the course back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, she underwent electroshock therapy, which is, I don't know if they still do that, or gosh, I hope not, but as a way of combating the oral, auditory hallucinations that she was experiencing, as well as these catatonic states that she would go into. And so I think, and she people have definitely speculated about the relationship between her painting and her mental health. I would say it seems pretty clear to me that someone who is experiencing such stressful mental health issues would produce work that would alleviate some of those symptoms. Anyway, as I said, she's settled in New Mexico, and yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about some of her biography as we go here. I just thought I would just show really quickly some images of her work, just to give you an idea of typical Agnes Martin paintings. And I know right off the bat there's going to be some people who are just like, like, you gotta be kidding me. Are you serious? Like, this is not the kind of painting that I'm into. A person who draws a bunch of lines and puts dots in between those lines? Come on. And then there's other people who will look at this artwork and find it deeply inspirational, who will get it right off the top. And, you know, she's, you know, certainly one of the most famous, most beloved abstract painters of all time. Arguably in the top 3 or 5 female abstract artists of all time, no doubt, hands down. Yeah, so just as you just scroll down here, you see there's the grid is a major part of her work, which we're going to be making today. We're going to take a look at how she approached that. And also just these very subdued colors. And I think when you start thinking about, you know, Zen Buddhism, I think a lot, and you look at it through that lens, I think a lot of this work starts to make a little bit more sense. That this idea of this repetitive, particular, like an artwork which there's actually a couple of great interviews. If you just YouTube her and you put her name into the search bar here on YouTube, you'll see a number of interviews with her, and she talks very specifically about getting rid of all of the ideas in her mind. In one of the interviews, she talks about how she used to meditate. She had a meditative practice, and once she learned how to basically turn her brain off, she stopped meditating. Now, I meditate. I've never been able to turn my brain off, but she talks about how, you know, most art today, I think this is an interview in the late 90s, was idea-based, and she didn't want ideas in her work. She wanted art that was about feelings and expression, and not about illustrating images or stories or ideas. That's interesting. I've never seen this painting. I don't know what that is. From 2003. I didn't realize she was still making work at 2003. Anyway, was there another image I wanted to show? Let's just get right into the painting. Today is going to be a little bit different because we're gonna be looking at her method of painting is very different than a lot of the work that we've done so far. So let's take a look at. Let's first just get this grid onto the canvas as quickly as possible, and you could use your ruler to draw some lines across here. Again, I've provided this template on the Dropbox, which you can download, you can print out onto regular photocopy paper. And I just realized I closed. Okay, let's open this back up again. Okay, so I'm going to play this video, and as it plays, I'll talk over it and just about how this process works. So you can see that I'm going to take this printout and I'm going to tape it onto the canvas. I'm basically roughly centering it, and I use a ruler just to see if I can get the it relatively straight. Right? It would be kind of a little bit weird if it was super crooked. So The other thing that I haven't mentioned so far is most of her paintings, you may have seen in the video, in the images I was just showing, most of her artwork is on a square format canvas, which is quite important to her work. Obviously, as in this series of painting, I'm trying to simplify things for viewers at home, and just using these 9x12 rectangular format canvases. And so I have extended the top and bottom of this painting for that purpose, but hopefully we'll arrive at a composition that does not degrade the integrity of her work here. So you'll see I'm just tracing all these lines down. And when I get here, then I'm drawing this line vertically, and you can see how I moved the carbon paper so I could get all the way at the top and bottom, and we'll peel that off. Okay, so, and there we go. So now we've got this image. Don't worry about making it perfect, because as we'll see, even though her work looks rigid and stiff because of the grid, at its heart, she considered herself an abstract expressionist, just like Jackson Pollock. And that certainly is not the first thing I think about when I think about her work, is expression, is this sort of exuberant expression. But I think she saw the grid as a method of actually helping to foster expression within this rigid system. So what I'm going to do here is you can see that there wasn't, the paper did not extend completely edge to edge. So I'm just going to extend these lines here. It's a little bit far away, so I'm just going to go like that. Okay. Now, let's move these. Well, maybe we'll need that. We may also, a few things, if I can find my materials. Where did I put my gesso? So one of the unusual things with Agnes Martin is the way that she used materials. Most of the time, in almost every episode we've done thus far, I take these canvas boards, which I've ordered from Amazon. You want to get the exact one, there's a link in the description below. I take them, I sand them down after I open it, and then I apply some gesso on top, which is just paint with a bit of like a plaster powder inside. And artists use that because it creates a nice absorbent surface that is going to absorb the acrylic paint really nicely. And then after that dries, then I sand it down again with some sandpaper. Agnes Martin is a little bit different. Now what she does is she actually applies the gesso, does one coat, lets it dry, does not sand it, applies more gesso, and does not sand that either. So she actually wants some texture on the canvas. And that's, you know, I always say that there are some artists that like to do that. Agnes Martin is sort of like the flag bearer for rough textured canvas. Now, I've already pre-sanded these canvases. I have a sort of assembly line process. I like to do a whole bunch all at once. But let's try to recreate a little bit of this process here. Because what she's going to do next is she's going to do a third coat of gesso using a bunch of water and adding some color to the gesso. Now, if you don't have gesso at home, you could just use white paint and mix it in with so you could substitute this, because it's going to look very much like white paint. In fact, most people won't know the difference. But just so I can demonstrate this for anyone interested, I'm actually going to use gesso. Now I'm using this big jug of gesso. This cost like $60. You could easily spend about $200 on like a super premium brand of gesso. I don't think you would really want to spend that much money on gesso personally. Yeah, there's always somebody who wants to use the most expensive materials possible. So what I'm going to do, because let's actually bring up this image here on the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down, I'm going to make a little bit of an off yellow, I think, color. Yeah, this one right up here. So, and we're gonna put a lot of water in this. So I'm just gonna scoop out a little bit of gesso like that. In fact, I might not even need that much as it squirts down onto the table. Now, obviously gesso is going to cover up some of these pencil lines. That's why I'm gonna put some water in there. She did lots of many coats of paint, including gesso, to build up some texture. Okay, so I'm going to move that out of the way. And then let's get our paints out. And I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a little bit of warm yellow. I'm going to try to mix this almost a little bit of a gray. Warm yellow, cool blue, and a bit of warm red. Let's get all these paints out onto the table. So again, you could do this with just white paint. So if you're sitting here like, oh no, I don't have gesso, I can't do today's painting. Don't worry, you can substitute this. It won't get the exact same effect, but I think you'll get it pretty quick. So I'm going to grab my paintbrush. Maybe actually let's mix this gray together. So take this warm red. Let's take some warm blue and mix this together. So now we've got a kind of a brownish color. This is actually kind of like our darkest color that we can really get, to be honest. So I'm going to mix this in there. Nice dark color like that. And then I'm just going to come over and mix a little bit into this yellow. Okay. So what I've got now is this kind of ugly purpley brown, right? Which is not the prettiest color ever, but it's not really important because what we're going to do is we're going to significantly dilute it with this white. So what I'll do, I'm going to wipe this excess paint off. And then I'm just going to mix it into this central bit of gesso. So the point is just to slightly discolor the gesso a little bit. It's still very close to the original. Let's just put a little bit more. I think I'm going to go, I was going to do this quite subtle, but I don't think it's going to show up on screen, so I'm just going to add a little bit more. Because obviously we're going to put some water in this next, and I think that water is going to make this color look, it'll be very, very thin, and when we apply it, it'll almost be like a watercolor stain on this surface. So I think that's, well, let's see how it works. Normally what I do is I apply like a yellow ground to start. Said this is a little bit different than what we've been doing thus far. Okay. So I can already feel, like, the difference between gesso and white paint is I can already kind of hear like a grainy, kind of gritty texture, and that's that plaster kind of powder that's in here. Now this might be a little bit on the darker side. Let's put a bit more of the white gesso back in. Okay. So move that off, and then I'm going to paint this. Onto this surface. Now she would probably have done this before doing any pencil lines. I put the pencil lines down there first just because this is, you know, an intro painting class, and I want to try to give people the sense of satisfaction of completing a version of one of these great artists' work. Without too much trouble. But if you were to try to do this authentically, first of all, you'd be using a square canvas and not a rectangular canvas, and then you'd apply this gesso coat on top, and then afterwards put your pencil lines on there. And she had various different ways of putting pencil lines on. She would use tape, she would use a ruler, she would use a string tied from one end to the other. Some of them she even just eyeballed, that she drew freehand. Okay. So this should dry relatively quickly. The plaster dust, or the gesso, which is, you know, it's not technically plaster, but it's very similar, will the water in it will evaporate quite quickly, and so this should be dry within just a couple minutes here. So while that's drying, let's start thinking about the next color that we want to apply on this painting. And so let's move that palette out of the way. One of the reasons why I like using a separate palette like this for my underpainting is that I can always sort of set it aside, and if, you know, some catastrophe happened at some point in the painting, I have the paint right here I could go back to and use, as opposed to on my palette that might get mixed in with other colors, or other colors splashed all over it, and I might lose that. So especially if you're doing a kind of a custom color on the beginning of your painting, you might want to think of using this approach. Okay, so as this is drying, it's also lightening up a bit. It's not going to be as dark, I think, as when I first applied it, which is totally fine. All right. So let's get our palette out. Now, obviously, for today's painting, we're really only going to be using a couple of colors here. So we don't need to put every color on our palette today. Let me just put all my labels on here anyway. So the two colors that I'm going to use, I'm going to use a cool blue and a warm red. And you saw that these are also colors that I used in my background color, and that's also important. You know, when you're talking about an artist like Agnes Martin, who's really narrowing her focus. I was going to say simplify. It's not really simplifying. It's just being super specific. And I think she is using color in a very, like, basically all that's left on a painting like this is color and some lines, but we don't have you know, images of a person's face or a horse in a field or a building, or, you know. So really the main focus of her energy is on thinking about color relationships, and she's using these warm and cool colors, which we've been talking about for almost a year now as part of these episodes, to help to create this what is often called like a push-pull effect, where you have warm colors that are advancing, coming, that sort of have this illusion of coming towards you, and then the cool colors moving into the background. And so by using a warm color and then a cool color, we have these two things moving around in space, right? And creating this kind of optical illusion for the eyes. So I think it is helpful to think about using, just like we used warm and cool, the warm red and the cool blue and we mix that into our gesso. We're going to use some warm red and cool blue. Now, yeah, if we were, there's other paintings of hers, and I probably would have done, if the painting had a different set of colors, I would probably mix those colors into the original background wash as well. So let's, I'm going to use a smaller brush for this. So what she's doing is she's also diluting these paints significantly with various different types of medium. And you could use actually, what she would often use is like a gloss glazing liquid. I was going to use my satin glazing liquid, but I think I'm going to use a little bit of, I don't usually use gloss glazing liquid. You could also use your matte medium or a gloss medium. Potentially, if all you had was Mod Podge, I think you could probably use that as well and get similar sort of effects. Some people, if you don't have anything at all, you could use water, but I'm always hesitant to, you know, that's often what people use. They think acrylic paint, I want to add water all the time. Water, you really only want to use maybe at the very beginning of the painting and then for washing your brushes. Other than that, you really want to try to avoid mixing water into your acrylic paint. So anyway, I think, is this a brand new tube here? So I think, you know, she also, if you've ever seen these paintings in person, you know, they're not much to look at on a computer screen. And they're also not much to look at from across the room, or at least that's my opinion. And it's not really until you get up close to them where you kind of, the magic starts to happen. And So from far away, they just look like, I don't know, what would you say they look like? They do look fairly bland, right? But I think the magic of her work is when you get up close and you see the detail, and you see the handmade quality of these paintings, is where it gets like really pleasurable as a viewer, I guess you could say. So I'm going to take some of this gloss glazing fluid. Maybe I'll do the blue with medium as opposed to a gloss. Well, these are mediums, but I'll use maybe my matte medium for the blue. So what I'm going to do here is I'm taking this glazing fluid. Let's just get a bit of red. Put this into the glazing fluid here. And we're just going to get this really diluted. Right now it looks kind of pink because essentially, I mean, the glazing fluid looks white when it's wet. As it dries, it's going to dry totally clear. So what we're doing is we're extending the paint. We're diluting it. So it goes from being like the super concentrated mixture to this very thinned out color. Okay, so I'm going to take this and basically I'm just going to take this paint and I'm going to go every second line. I'm going to leave, if possible, the top and the bottom without any paint at all. Just like in her image here. You'll see that this very first layer is the raw canvas, and then the bottom layer is also the raw canvas, right? So we'll try to do a little bit of that. So let's, I'm going to zoom in just so you can see here. Now, you can see that color is barely visible as I go across here. So you may, to do this correctly, this is exactly what you'd want to do. And she actually also used acrylic paint as well, which is a little bit unusual for some of the abstract painters. A lot of them were still using oil paint. All right, and I'm just going to go down here. So I think I'm going to do like this. If you're a little bit more impatient, you could certainly add a lot more red to your color, because what you would do is paint it like this, let it dry, and then paint another layer over top of it. So the natural question is, what is the difference between doing 2, 3, 5, she would do sometimes between 8 and 10 layers of paint like this. What is the difference between doing 10 layers of this red paint versus 1 layer of much darker color? And the difference is, what's the best way to explain it? It's sort of like looking, if you go down to the beach and you look at water in a puddle versus water in the ocean. You know, if you put your hand into the water in the ocean, it looks clear, right? But if you're, let's say you're standing on a boat and you look into the water, it's dark, especially if it's a deep, like ocean or something, or deep lake, because there's lots of, you could think of them small thin layers of water layered one after another on top of one another, versus the water on the beach is very thin and there's, you know, maybe 1 or 2 layers, and so we can see the sand through it, right? So part of this idea of layering paint is building up a depth of color that you just can't get from putting one just big, heavy, solid layer of paint in that particular location. Okay, so this is going to take me a little bit of time. She also took her time doing this. Remember, we just sort of briefly talked about her struggles with mental health and her schizophrenia, and I think it's quite clear to me that someone who is having that kind of difficulty would search for a kind of art that she could do that would allow her basically to turn off the voices in her head. Remember, she was having oral hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. She was a very private person who did not talk really about these the experiences she had, and therefore we're not really sure to this day exactly how bad those experiences were, but we do know that she had schizophrenia and struggled to deal with it. So I think there's, you know, I hesitate to say like somebody's, you know, to make such a direct connection between that type of issue and the way that the art ultimately turns out and how it looks. But like Yayoi Kusuma, who I mentioned earlier, who's famous for doing her dots as a way of quieting her mind, right? Here we have Agnes Martin, who's using lines in a grid to offer some kind of respite from that mental anguish that she struggled with throughout her entire life. So, you know, on camera, I wonder how much of that's going to come through. I imagine it's very subtle, and probably some of you can't even see any of these warm red lines that I'm putting on my canvas right now. Which is fine. I think that's a big part of her work, you know, is sort of trusting in the process. But over time, as I continue doing this, I think maybe for today's episode, I'll do, well, we'll see, maybe 2 or 3 layers of color. I'll slowly build it up. After this, I'm going to transition to the blue, and then we'll do blue, and we'll alternate, and we'll come back to the red. And I know that there's going to be plenty of people who are part of our community who will look at this and say, yeah, I don't know if that's a kind of a painting I want to spend my time, or I want to waste a canvas on. The thing that I would say is, just like any of the other artists we've looked at, you know, by painting a little bit in their style, I think it not only helps us understand that artist and their life and their process, but I think gives us a greater appreciation for different kinds of work in general. Like, I think if you make this painting, if you ever go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York or the Tate in England, and you look at Agnes Martin on the wall, or really any abstract painting for that matter, I think you'll look at it very differently, and you'll probably think about the experience of the artist spending, you know, all this time and energy making something that for some people just looks, quite frankly, very bland and boring. And then also understanding that she really could care less. That she was happy with the painting she made. She's become one of the most famous artists of her time. So clearly there's something there that some people appreciate. Okay, so let's see if I can just zoom in and we can see, so you can see the paint that I've applied there. You can see it's not perfect. I haven't taken my little tiny brush and done a lot of fiddling, and I don't think she did either. She was really all about moving forward, like not getting wrapped up in perfection. I think she was striving for perfection. Often what she would do, if these paintings didn't turn out, she would literally throw them out. She would destroy them rather than try to fix them, right? Now, that's not something I generally recommend. I think it's, you want to try to finish whatever you start, but I could see some people, you know, if the painting isn't turning out, to literally scrap it. Okay. So there's layer number one. Let's just take a look at the painting originally here and what we've got. So it's going to take a few more layers to get to that little bit darker red that we see in the original. So I'm just going to wipe this paint off. And then let's do the same thing on the other side here. I'm going to use some glazing fluid. And then let's just take a little bit of this blue and mix it in. That might even be too much blue. I mean, there's barely, that was like 1 or 2 grains of salt in there, and it went still pretty dark. So let's put more glazing fluid to attempt to dilute that color. I think that's much better. Yeah. So let's start back up at the top. Maybe I'll zoom back in again. Where's the top? There we are. Right, so I'm going to also leave, remember this top layer, I'm going to leave blank. I'm going to go down to layer number 2 here. Yeah, so again, the difference between painting a bunch of thin layers together, which is, you know, very traditional. Like that's basically how the Mona Lisa was painted. So she's using like very traditional way of painting to create something very different and very modern. We're also going to use some colored pencils on this painting at some point here. I think maybe towards the very end. I'm going to use some white colored pencils to go over top of my pencil lines. She might have done that earlier, I think she, but as opposed to putting black lines down, she might have used white pencil. But again, I'm just trying to taking her working process and sort of adapting it for our class. You can see there's areas where I've gotten, I'm a little bit sloppy, I'm a little bit impatient, right? So there's a bit of texture that's building up here. That would probably not be something she would appreciate. I think she would probably, if If she was showing us how to make this painting, I think she would probably frown on that. But I'm just going to continue regardless. That building up those ridges like that is going to essentially there's like there's more pigment in those raised areas, so they're going to be a little bit darker ultimately when that paint dries. So these paintings are also quite big too. They're roughly like 60 by 60 inches big. Remember, they're all square canvases for the vast majority of her work. Square or very close to square. So they're large paintings. I think she would have used a very small brush like I'm using even when she was painting on large canvases. And it also just brings me just to this idea of using square canvas. The square canvas has a interesting history in art, because traditionally artists would paint on rectangular or oval shaped canvases, and very, very rarely would they use a square canvas. Really, the first people to use square canvases were abstract painters at the turn of the 20th century. So some of the very first abstract paintings were done using square canvas. And you might say, like, why? What is it about square canvases that attracted abstract painters? Well, if you think about it, we even talk about, you know, like say a piece of paper like this. This is portrait orientation, and this is landscape orientation. So if you're using a rectangular canvas, literally the way that it would sit on the wall would already sort of tip off the viewer as to the way that you might want to read the painting, right? That if it is in the landscape format, one might try to find the landscape within it. Or if it was portrait format, one might try to find the face or the object or whatever, still life, that might be in that image. So by using a square format canvas, it's neither a landscape nor a portrait. So it complicates that sort of easy reading as a portrait or a landscape, which is exactly what they wanted. They didn't want people to see a face or to see a mountain range or a city or anything else in there. They wanted people just to purely see colors, lines, and shapes. Okay, so now I've painted. We did the first layer, the gesso layer, in which we added warm red, cool blue, and a little bit of warm yellow. So we got that little bit of a off, almost like an unbleached titanium color, eggshell kind of color. And then we added some warm red with some gloss glazing fluid. And then we painted some cool blue with some gloss glazing fluid. So this painting right now is very, very subtle. Like if we look here, this is ultimately where we want to get to. So it's obviously going to require more layers of paint on here. Now, as I'm making the painting, I think to myself, should I mix more pigment in there just to speed up this process a little bit, so that at the end it's will be closer to what you see on the screen right now? I think I think I'm just gonna do a couple more layers like this. I'm gonna take my time, really try to fully embrace not only the style of painting, but the mental headspace that is required to do this kind of repetitive task over and over and over again. So that might make for maybe less interesting of a video to watch, but ultimately I think we'll get much closer to her original, the painting that we're studying today. And I also think we will be able to sort of appreciate what this particular sort of process, how it yields fundamentally a different experience of color than just a thick single flat layer of color. I see Ace and Don are there in the chat. Good to see you guys. Okay. So these are both still quite wet. I'm actually going to blow dry them really quickly, just to kind of speed up the drying process. And then I'll start over with the red paint. In fact, let's just clean that brush right now. Now I'm going to mute this microphone. Okay, one thing, you know, for this painting I'm using the gloss glazing fluid, and one of the reasons I generally don't use gloss is it can make it a little bit difficult to see what's dry and what is not dry, right? Because everything remains shiny, and usually acrylic paint, when it's wet, is shiny, and when it dries, it goes matte. So one of the things that we see here is by using this gloss glazing fluid, it makes it a little bit trickier to know exactly when things are dry or not. I think things are still a little bit wet. I'm just going to continue moving forward here though. Oh, I was going to use matte medium. Well, I'll use matte medium for the blue this time. I'll put it right here so I don't forget it. Okay, so let's continue this again. I'm going to start off with my red up top here. I mean, it does make me really wonder, like, what, you know, as she's painting like this, what is she thinking about? Is she literally not thinking about anything as she claims in her interviews? Like, or is she listening to the radio? Apparently she didn't read the newspaper for the last 50 years of her life. So she probably, if she was listening to the radio, she probably wasn't listening to the news or talk radio. She might have been listening to some music. Or was she like literally just dialed, like so focused and dialed right in that this kept her mind and the voices in her head at bay. You know, this type of painting also reminds me a lot of like fiber art, or like, you know, like knitting or quilt making, in that it's this task that is relatively straightforward and just requires time and concentration. Like, this is not the kind of painting that I make on my own. But I think it's, you know, doing this kind of thing just gives me such a great deal more respect for another artist. I mean, I've loved her paintings for a long time. Like I said, as I started to kind of, as I looked at the work that she made earlier, which we're going to make tomorrow, I kind of was like, oh, okay. I totally get it. I totally see how she got from point A to point B. And it's very satisfying, I think. Okay. So let's just see. Let's actually look at them both side by side. A little bit of ways to go. You know, that red, I'm pretty close. I mean, it looks like there's actually maybe even a bit of warm yellow in this to make it a bit more orangey than what I have. But I don't know, I think it's probably just going to stick with what I've got. Okay, I said I was going to use some of the matte medium here. So this will be interesting to see how the matte medium, especially now that I painted some gloss blue, how that's going to affect things. Let's get some of this matte medium on here. Take just a little bit. I mean, we're talking a little bit, right? So matte medium is essentially just paint without any color in it. And it's different than glazing fluid. But I think for many people, it has very similar properties. It's also a little bit cheaper, quite frankly. So let's just... I'm actually also very curious to see what this matte medium, if it will completely get rid of the glossy quality of the first blue layer I put down underneath. Matte medium should dry much faster than glazing fluid. Glazing fluid also has a bit of a slow dry mechanism in there. It'll slow the drying process down a little bit, although not nearly as fast as your slow dry medium, which is, you know, the intended purpose for that particular product, right? Okay, so I'll do think I'll do this. I'll let it dry, and then we'll do one more layer, and then I'm going to draw some lines over top of this with some colored pencils. I think she probably, as I mentioned earlier, did her colored pencil layer first, but I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I think this is really beautiful. Like, this is definitely the least amount of viewers I think I've ever had on an episode. So clearly, beginner artists are not generally maybe interested in this type of work. But, you know, I'm painting my favorite artists, and maybe this will be an episode people skip and then come back to when they've exhausted all the other episodes. And if that's you, I can understand. Or if that's you several years from now, because we're filming this live, right? So slowly, you know, if we did a time lapse of this, I think you would see the painting changing, you know, incrementally. Obviously, when we're doing it in real time, those changes are extremely subtle. So let's see. I think I'm gonna blow dry this again. I see a bunch of more comments pop up in the chat. So I'll take a look at those while this is drying here. So okay, so one thing I notice is, well, let's just see if I rotate. I was going to say it looked like the top was darker than the bottom for some reason as I was painting them. So I'm just going to rotate the canvas also so that maybe some, you know, our bodies are going to create maybe little arcs. So maybe by rotating it around, I'll kind of even out any sort of displacement that's caused by painting it left to right all the time, because now I'm sort of painting right to left but upside down. Now there is this discoloration. That's from my original gessoing, and I went across this edge without going left to right, so that's a little bit of a bummer, especially when that's really all we have on the canvas is, and we see this sort of discoloration like that. It's a little bit frustrating, but oops, that's way too much paint in here. Alright, so I just put some of this glazing fluid in there, but got a little too much pigment on, so let's dilute that. Also, I actually wanted to just show the difference now that we've got one layer's glossy, the red layer's glossy, and the blue layer has matte medium in it. So it really took down the shine off of that blue layer. I was surprised actually how well that worked. I was suspecting it wouldn't, it would still be pretty reflective, but anyway. So there's way more pigment in here than I was hoping. I could keep diluting this, but I think after this next layer of red, I'll just leave it be, and we'll do another layer of the blue. So this will probably be a little bit of a darker layer anyway, but you know, the other thing too, you know, if she's using this particular process as a way of dealing with those literal voices in her head, it makes a lot of sense, just like Kasuma, that you'd want to take like the slowest method possible to get from point A to point B, because as soon as you finish the painting, well, now you got to start another one as quickly as possible to keep those voices and sounds at bay, right? And so by sort of focusing all of her energy into like one painting over a longer period of time, I think she could like really try to make like a really great painting using like the most traditional, slowest painting method possible. You know, which is really interesting. I think you hear most artists talking, even myself, talking about speeding up your painting process and not laboring over things. And you know, for every example I can think of an artist who worked really, really quickly, like Picasso probably being the most famous artist who made tons of work and did them all very, very quickly. You have someone like Agnes Martin who works very slowly. You can also think of it from a business perspective. Yes, you know, a company would want to try to crank out as much product as possible, but because it took her a while to make each painting, the paintings she did make are highly valued and sell for tens of millions of dollars. So there's something to be said about scarcity. You know, Picasso made so many artworks that literally, to break the Guinness Book of World Records, which he held for the most amount of artworks created and sold during his life, a guy in New York went into the subway and made drawings on Post-it notes and sold them for a penny in order to break that record. Right? That's literally, like, Picasso was grinding out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of works, making prints and lithographs, making multiples of his sculptures and posters. Like, he was basically printing money. Versus Agnes Martin taking her sweet time. So, you know, it also makes me think about, like, what is it about New Mexico that artists have found so inspiring for so many years, that many of the great artists, also particularly a lot of women artists, have moved down to the American South, often leaving New York to go to New Mexico, particularly kind of also in their 50s and 60s, sort of leaving the rat race of New York, moving to New Mexico. I don't really know. I've only driven through New Mexico very briefly, going between California and Texas, and so I don't know. I didn't really get a chance to spend too much time there. But I think, like, New Mexico kind of holds a real special place in American mythology, in a similar way that I think the Yukon or Dawson City, even more specifically, holds in the Canadian imagination and self-mythology. I think, like, I was fortunate enough to go up to Dawson City in the Yukon and spend a couple of months there painting in, I don't know, it was years ago now, and I came away thinking, like, this is what I think a lot of Canadians, when they, if you could distill Canada down, this is what I think what a lot of Canadians think of Canada as this very small town where everyone knows one another. It is bitterly cold in the winter, but it, you know, people let loose in the summer. And Canadians from all across Canada, French Canadians, English Canadians, tourists from all over the world, particularly Germans, flock to the Yukon. And also in Dawson City, the indigenous population there is the largest employer in Dawson City. The band has a big building, kind of community center in the center of town, and people gather there, white and indigenous and every color, and so it gives off the impression of a place that is, like, really well integrated in a way that maybe not other places in Canada are. And so if I carry that metaphor to the United States and New Mexico, I think New Mexico also has that kind of a pull for Americans, and people from all over the world as well, but that it kind of embodies this big open space where people can be themselves, because there's, you know, the government, the federal government anyway, is literally on the other side of the continent, and you know, you could say, well, that's like Los Angeles or San Francisco. I think, you know, New Mexico is sort of like this. It's almost a little bit forgotten in some way, and you know, it's, you know, like a lot of other states in the interior United States, you know, sort of derided as this flyover state, where the, you know, people will fly over New Mexico to get between Los Angeles and New York. And there's some people who actually really like that. They're like, yeah, fine, fly right over, leave us alone. we actually are really happy to have. We don't want anybody here. we want to have our space to ourselves. We don't want you to come in here and tell us how to live our lives. We kind of like living off the grid a little bit, which is, again, a lot like Dawson City and most of the Yukon. I think it's also a place in the United States where the traditional indigenous population is still fairly visible, and the art and styles, clothing, artwork, patterns, etc., are still very are really a major part of that Southwestern identity, right? Maybe even more so than the cowboy kind of look and style, which is much bigger in Texas or Nevada or Utah even. Whereas in New Mexico, obviously there's ranching is a big part of the economy. But I do get the sense that, like, in New Mexico, I think one of the things people appreciate about it is that it seems to have maybe, and this is just me just blabbing while I'm painting, and just the way that I see it as an outsider, but maybe less of a colonized kind of space than some of those other states. And I'm sure if you talk to indigenous person, American Indian, they may have very different feelings there, and they might say, well, there's maybe some horrible atrocities were committed in New Mexico, so whatever you're saying right now doesn't hold any water at all. But like if you go to New York or Los Angeles, both places that had very strong indigenous populations prior to contact with the West, you'd be very hard pressed to see any signs of that today, right? Whereas in New Mexico, like that very striking pattern that we see is like really fully embedded into the identity of the Southwest. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on things. Let's take a look at these side by side. So now, actually, my lines, my red is almost, maybe you could even say, darker than the one in the original image. So I might even have gone a little bit too far. But that's okay. I think as this dries, the color will fade a little bit and it won't be quite so dense. I could be convinced to do another layer of the blue. I'm not sure. Let's see, we'll just back that out a little more. How are we doing for time? An hour and a half. That is hard to say. If anything, right now, I would be more tempted to add another layer of blue on here. Again, can we see the... You can see the red, it looks wet, but most of it is dry. That's the glossy glaze versus the blue, which has the matte medium mixed in there, which is also a little bit wet, but certainly as it's drying is going totally non-reflective. I see in the in the chat there, Heidi just popped in and says, wow, quite a different painting from yesterday's. Much more calming to me. Yeah, very different painting than the Cubist paintings we did yesterday by Kathleen Munn, right? Right, so this is one of the paintings we made yesterday. And there's the other painting we made yesterday. So, you know, on the surface they're like about as different as possible. Although you could say, you know, there is certain similarities between Cubism and Cubism is an abstraction from reality, right? You could say basically any type of art is an abstraction from reality. There's just some things that are maybe more abstract versus some things that are more representational than others. And I would say actually, you know, because I think people think like, oh, like a realistic painting is something that you paint an apple and it looks like an apple, right? I would say that there's probably a lot of abstract painters who would say, you know, or like Agnes Martin, yes, I did not paint a landscape, I did not paint a face, but this is also very realistic. This is depicting my experience, my feelings, this is an authentic, realistic depiction of what's going on inside, right? Similarly with Cubist painting, saying like, yeah, it doesn't look like a photograph, but in some ways it's more authentic to the way we experience reality than a photograph's, you know, documentation or version of reality. Both of them are abstractions from reality. Because we all know that a photograph doesn't always tell the whole story, right? We've had photographs of ourselves taken, maybe it's your passport photo or a photo on your driver's license, you're like, oh, that doesn't even really look like me, or what an awful, right? We have those feelings of like, oh, that doesn't feel like me. I don't recognize that. Or sometimes you see a photograph, like my wife and I take photographs, lots of photos of our daughter every day, and there's definitely, when we look at some of the older photographs, I'm like, I don't even recognize that child. And it causes a little bit of anxiety, because I think like, oh, that's... I obviously I know it's our daughter, but it doesn't... I don't really remember her looking like that, right? So you could say that photograph, in some ways, you could say that is not an accurate depiction of my experience of my daughter, right? That it doesn't, because I literally don't recognize it. Versus you might say, well, this is actually more accurate of a depiction of someone's experience and feelings than a photograph of that same sort of thing, right? Anyway, it's also, these are all very kind of, you know, these philosophical kind of debates you can have, but abstract painting sort of pulls us down that pathway of more abstract thought, right? Which is, for some people, a great thing. Some people love having this type of ruminations, meditations on an idea, and some people don't. They want to. They're just like, I don't want to think about this. That's kind of disinteresting to me. I want to just make a really cool painting that looks like a Star Wars figure or Batman, both of which we've done, right? Okay. I think things have dried enough that I think I'm going to put one... Should I put another layer of blue on there? I'm almost hesitant to do that. I kind of... You know, a big part of this type of painting, specifically Agnes Martin, is the subtlety, right? In fact, I just want to go back to her work here and just take another look at these images and just thinking about, like, well, I can keep mine up here. Like look at the subtlety in the colors in between here. Right? Like these very subtle differences of color. Right, a painting which might just look like white, but when you get up close you see the grid on there. Anyway. Okay, so maybe I'll, well, let's just see. I think what I want to do next is I might even blow dry this because I want to use my ruler over top. So I'm going to blow dry this, and then I'm going to use a ruler, and I'm going to get out a white pencil, and we're going to do some pencil lines over top of this. So I'm just going to mute. So you may see me picking at this painting. There was I got a little bit gummy down there, so I'm just going to try to might have made it a little bit worse. You know, she would sort of allow for some of that, the little bit messy qualities of the painting to happen. She didn't want too much of it, but I think she allowed a little bit in there. I think she liked a little bit of I think she liked that tension between something looking a little bit. I don't think she wanted it to look absolutely perfect. I think there's that little bit of the handmade that she found attractive. So I'm just taking a little bit of the gesso, like I mentioned right off the top, and just doing quick little touch-ups. I'm going to blow dry this again where I've done those touch-ups, and then I'm going to do one more. I see Heidi in the chat says, wow, the original is 72 inches by 72. So you could see much larger canvas. That's like, you know, a piece of plywood is 48 by 96 inches, which is big, right? So you're talking 72 is maybe at your arm's length. This would be a big painting. Donna says, I found yesterday's painting a little busy. I love bright, so not sure why. Yes, the Cubist paintings tend to be a little bit overwhelming with a lot of detail. They're not only, we talked about that unfolding and seeing things all at once. Well, if you imagine if you saw something all at once, it would be visually experientially overwhelming, right? Like if I saw everything around me and I could see their front, sides, top, bottom, back sides all at once, there would just be, there's already a lot of stuff in the visual world around us, but you're talking like 6 times the amount of imagery happening, right? So Cubist paintings tend to be really busy, really overwhelming, a lot of detail, a lot of stuff happening all at once. And I think that's exactly what they wanted, right? So you can think of, like, if that was the first time you ever saw a Cubist painting, how just like it would be like a message from outer space, from a different civilization. It just seems like so completely now we're used to it. We've had 100 years of since the beginning of Cubism, so it's not shocking anymore, but man, when it happened, it blew people's minds. Joshua said, I do love Agnes Martin, and I did paint my version of Agnes Martin, but it didn't get a lot of attention on the Facebook page, so I see what you're talking about. Yeah, I haven't seen your work on the Facebook page yet, Joshua. I haven't been a little bit busy. Earlier today, my daughter and I went to the Children's Hospital so that we could get both her and I COVID tests, because our daughter is sick today, and in the world we're living in right now, what does that mean? Could she be really sick? So, knock on wood, that she's just got a regular cold, which, again, you're like, how on earth did she get a regular cold when we've been very safe? So that just goes to show kind of how wild the world we're living in right now actually is. So, okay. So next I'm getting out my colored pencils. Now this is an opportunity for you to go a little bit wild. You could use lots of different colored pencils. I'm going to go for a white pencil here, so that we can kind of get closer to the original, because we've got these lines on the painting. Now, we'll see how much of an effect this actually has. Let me see if this is dried enough. I think so. I hope. Actually, you know what? I have a ruler that's got some cork on the bottom. I have lots of different rulers. My fear of using just a acrylic plastic ruler like this, I don't know if you can You can hear it kind of sticking to the surface a little bit. Let's see if this... No stick, right? Let me see if... There's a bit of stick when I go on that side, right? So that's why it's nice to have different tools for different jobs. I'm going to just sharpen this pencil quickly. Okay. So I'm going to start with this. Actually, you know what? I was going to start with that vertical line, but I'm afraid if I do that, it might smudge as I go down. So let's just see. Where should we start? Maybe let's start here at the bottom. Doesn't show up very well. Again, I don't know. I think she probably did this type of a line first and then painted around it. It's not really showing up very well. Doesn't surprise me, like a white pencil crayon on the acrylic. So if anything, what that white line did is might have smudged some of this blue and red together to actually make that line look darker than it was just a moment ago. You know, if I look at these, I could paint all these lines on here. I think that would just drive me absolutely bonkers. And that would take a while to do. So, the other option is to go the other way. If white isn't working, should we go the graphite way? So I'm just looking at some of the pencils I have. I have like a 5B here, a B, or is that an H? It's a B and HB. Now, the thing is if I use the 5B, I'll get a really nice dark line, but it'll smudge very easy. So I think I'm going to try using my regular HB pencil. And this could go horribly wrong. Very subtle, very subtle. I'll do a few of these. Yeah, I think I'm just going to continue, carry this through. I do have like acrylic markers that I could use that would have white that I could put over top of this. Or I could just leave it all by itself. And I feel like now that I've kind of committed to something, I want to see it through. So let's see. I think also this will work better the more dry this paint is. Having a bit of this paint being a little bit wet means that these pencil lines aren't going to You know, some of it is just like scraping through wet paint as opposed to sitting on top of the paint. So probably the best thing for me to do would be to actually just let this dry overnight and do pencil lines, whether it's black or white or blue or whatever color. I think I'll get results, but much better results than trying to do it right now while the paint is wet. But it's worth, I think, just for our purpose, just to kind of, for people to see what it might look like if we were to do this. So right now, if you're an impatient person like I can often be, definitely has a different effect having dark black lines. Even, and these lines aren't even that dark either, but it's different than if this was white, obviously. And maybe I'll put white lines on it after it dries. I may even use those acrylic markers after it dries, but the same thing. It's sort of like acrylic fluid that comes out of the paint, or out of the pen tip. I'll see if I can find it here after I'm done that. I usually use it for signing prints. Oops, there's my big head in the way. That's great. Good job, Michael. Let's put this. Should I do this one right down the middle? Maybe I'll leave this line there. Maybe I'll leave that like it is. Should I? I think technically this painting is supposed to look like that. Now, do I want to fix something like that? Like her philosophy, and again, this goes back to Eastern philosophy that she was interested in, Zen Buddhism, would be to, it's kind of like that wabi-sabi kind of thing of just embracing imperfection. So I think you try to fix a mistake if you can, but if you can't fix it, is just to embrace it, just to let it be. Or just to throw the whole thing out and start over. So, like, if it's too bad, if you can't live with it, then get rid of it. But so I'm just using a tool to. Another reason why I don't usually use gloss mediums or gloss glazing fluid, I always find it tends to just stay tacky for longer than matte medium. I don't know why it does that, but and since I'm a pretty hands-on person and a bit impatient, I don't like that kind of thing. So the thing is, like, that area there just keeps pulling my attention towards it. Let me see if I can just add a little bit of this blue. You know, one way I could try to get rid of that is if I use a little bit of my gesso. I paint over it with gesso. And then I can paint, see, then it just basically just disappears, right? That's so, I mean, I could even just leave it like that. You probably don't even notice where that was to begin with, right? Okay. Yeah, I think I might just leave it like that. I think that whatever that little problem area I think is gone. I feel much better about that. Okay, so let's just take a look at these side by side. Yeah, slightly different colors. Obviously, she's got white lines, or maybe even slightly yellowish lines in between. And I deliberately put my black graphite pencil to divide them, so it adds a bit of something different. But I think I'm gonna live with it. I'm pretty happy. So let's autograph this one here. This is maybe one of the quietest paintings we've done over the past 117 episodes, right? So probably the most subtle, the most quiet of all, which again, if you think about Zen Buddhism and about quieting the mind, imagine having a big painting like this, or many of them in your house, or sitting in an art gallery surrounded by these images. You'd probably feel the energy kind of come down a little bit. Like, it would be a great place just to close your eyes, to breathe, as opposed to like the Cubist paintings, which just is like loud. Like I said, people looked at that image by Marcel Duchamp and said it was an explosion in a shingle factory. Let's just take a quick look at. So, I don't know if you've seen this painting here. Nude descending a staircase. This is the painting I said that was derided by critics as like just an abomination, as an explosion in a shingle factory, which I think is funny. It's called Nude Descending a Staircase #2. It's intended to be like a nude female walking down some stairs, done in a kind of cubist / futurist method, or although Duchamp was never really a part of either of those movements. But you can see those type of paintings are just like visually overwhelming. Like, where does the eye even rest in a painting like here? Nowhere, right? There's really nowhere for the eye to take a break, because there's just so much going on. Versus this painting by Agnes Martin couldn't be more different, right? You could simultaneously say, well, where does the eye rest on a painting like this? Because just like the Marcel Duchamp or most Cubist paintings, it as well has, there's no single point to see for the eye to rest in the painting, but it's just certainly like, I think there's something calming about that grid It gives some sense of order and organization that the Cubist painting might have. There's certainly, we talked about Earl Laurent and Cézanne's compositions in that book, and about Cubist painters that had a very structured approach to their paintings. But it is really interesting to think of the similarities and the differences between Agnes Martin and Kathleen Munn, right, who we did yesterday. That anyway, yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way this one turned out. So tomorrow we're going to be painting that self-portrait by Agnes Martin of herself. As a self-portrait, so which was made about 30 years before today's painting. So I think it is kind of helpful for us to experience painting one of her most famous paintings, and then go back and see kind of how is there some seeds in that earlier painting that we're going to see, that we come to see later on in here, or is it literally totally different? I'll be interested to hear what you have to say tomorrow on tomorrow's episode. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you'll know when new episodes are coming up. If our daughter, I'll also say, if our daughter is even more sick tomorrow, it's possible that, and maybe I'm feeling a little bit under the weather as well, that the episode might start at 5 instead of 4, but so that's, again, a good reason to hit that notification bell, so if I change the time that the episode airs, you'll see it on YouTube when you log in. Also, if you want to contribute a small donation, there's a PayPal link below. If you want to send a check or e-transfer or whatever, contact me through the Facebook group or through my email on my website. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in 24 hours or less, or maybe you're watching this 5 years from now, and you can just watch that episode right now, right? Okay, everyone. I see more things in the chat here. Donna's redoing her art room. I'm so excited to see how that turns out. Good luck, Donna, on your renovations and your new setup. I think it's always really exciting to set up a new studio, or just give a refresh to the existing studio you have. As you guys have seen, the background and behind me changed quite radically from basically an unfinished basement to what you see behind me now over the course of the past year. So, and that's all due to your generous donation. So thank you, everyone, for supporting the channel, and we'll see you guys in the same time, same place tomorrow evening. Have a good night, everyone. We'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.